Booktube. Here are my thoughts on The Inquisitor's Tale by Adam Gidwitz. I'm Jen and I talk about audiobooks, and I thought I would share with you my thoughts on The Inquisitor's Tale by Adam Gidwitz. Listening Library was kind enough to send me a copy of this book. There has been a lot of buzz about this book, and I think it is well deserved. I did not initially think that. In fact, I almost didn't consent to review this book because it had three major strikes against it as far as I'm concerned. Those were that it is set in the 1200s. I have the Middle Ages. I have no interest in that time period, historical or otherwise. It's middle grade, and I don't generally read middle grade, and part of it is narrated by the author. And I think that generally speaking, that's a very bad idea, because authors know how they want their book to sound, but they are not trained to get it to sound that way. So yeah, I thought, okay, well, I thought I would go ahead and give it a try. You know, what did I have to lose? With my expectations being so low, boy, I was so surprised that I loved this book. This is a wonderful tale of three children and a dog and their adventures in France in, like I said, the 1200s. And it is narrated on audio by a full cast. The story is told in a style that is reminiscent of the Canterbury Tales. You have the Inquisitor, and he is a character that walks into a pub and starts asking questions about these children and the dog. And people in the pub either know the children or have been affiliated with the children, had some kind of experience with the children. And so they start telling their stories. And then at one point, the Inquisitor starts into his own story, and then the book finishes out with his experience with the children as it happens. These narratives from each of these characters about the children are witty, funny, poignant, sad, uplifting. They pretty much run the gamut. And through their stories with these children, Gidwitz is able to weave this wonderful story of friendship and loyalty and trust that is developed between these three children, the dog, and those adults that care for them and lead them and protect them. These children are very resourceful and they're very unassuming, and their reasoning is very innocent and yet practical. And that right there provides a lot of the book's entertainment. The idea that what we don't understand, we judge, and sometimes we even punish. This idea is told in a way that, of course, is set in the time period, and people tended to be much more that way because we didn't know the things that we know now. But it's told in such a way that it is very relatable to today's middle grade and older audience. And while there is some degree of magical realism going on, the real magic here is the way that these children solve their problems in such a pragmatic and yet imaginative way. Overall, the real strength of this book is the storytelling. And Gidwitz is able to take this setting of the Middle Ages, 1252, I think, and what's happening then, and present it in such a way that is so attractive, so interesting, and so relatable to the target audience for this book. I think he really achieved what he set out to do in showing the Middle Ages as a time that is not dark and dreary and just, you know, that way because people are so unaware and uninformed, and, you know, technology was at such a base level. He takes that and makes it interesting. He takes the people and develops these characters in such a way that they're entertaining, they're interesting, they have complex ideas about what's happening. New ideas are brought in, and you see how that, like I said, judgment and even punishment comes into play, and the threat that information is sometimes to those who are in power. Gidwitz is just a master at doing that, and this book just shines in that respect. On audio, the book does have its flaws, and I think my criticisms of the book largely stem from the way that it was narrated and not the story itself. There are French names for everything because obviously it's set in France, and so there are some terms that are strictly French, and all the places are French towns, and yet the cast chose to do the narration in a combination of American and British accents, and even a Scottish accent. And I just didn't think that that was appropriate. I thought the book would have been much better served and even enhanced if all the voice actors had used a French accent. It would have given it some grounding and just made it feel a little more realistic. An audio cast works beautifully when you have a whole cast of narrators, each doing a specific voice. And in this case, that worked really well. But also in this case, because it's like the Canterbury Tales, you have one character telling their experience with these children, but they're also voicing each secondary character contained within their story in a certain way. And when you have a whole slew of narrators doing that, different characters, then it tends to detract from the general atmosphere of the book, because each character telling their story is going to voice those secondary characters in a different way. The contrast is too great, one to the next. I think this book would have been far better served to present it like a radio play and give each character, the secondary ones also, their own voice. The story begins with Anne-Marie Lee narrating the part of the Brewster. The Brewster is a French peasant who has an interaction with Jean, who is one of the children. But Anne-Marie Lee is like a first grade teacher telling the story or reading the story to a group of kids. It's like it's written in a vernacular, and yet she doesn't really give voice to the vernacular. She does it like she's reading, like a Shakespearean actor would do it. And it just doesn't sound right. I think overall, she was miscast. She's a great narrator, but not for this part and not in this book. Kimberly Farr as the nun, however, is fantastic. She pulls the listener into the story and just does not let you go. I especially loved her voice for Michelangelo because she did him with an authentic sounding, at least to an American, Italian accent. And it really brought him to life, and it gave his character the kind of presence that it needed to have. And so overall, listening to her performance was just a pleasure. Mark Bramhall as the librarian was also very good. He gave voices to each character that were just a little bit different enough, distinct enough to give you the difference so you knew who was talking. While he was very instructive, he was also very appreciative of William's optimistic exuberance. Arthur Morey as the butcher and John H. Mayer as the innkeeper were equally good. They did capture that French peasant thing really well, and they sounded just like you would expect for a butcher and an innkeeper to sound in the 1200s in France. They were boisterous at times, they were practical, they sounded very common, like with that pragmatic sense of a peasant, and they really rounded out the whole atmosphere of the book. Bruce Mann as the jongleur chose a Cockney accent for this ne'er-do-well. His ability through that accent to convey this unreliable character was done very well. The character is sly and shrewd and conniving, and we are never completely sure if he's just embellishing the truth or it really is the truth. For Mann to be able to voice him and have all of those qualities come through in an authentic way, I thought was excellent. Jonathan Crowley as the chronicler was apparently Scottish, but his accent was all over the place. It was Scottish at times, British at times, Welsh at times, and it wasn't consistent. And because of that, it really drew me out of the story. And like I was talking about with, the individual narrators for each character who's telling their part of the story and the way that they voiced each secondary character being different, in this case, Crowley that came through really strongly. His voices for the secondary characters were so distinctly different that it really threw the whole thing off for me. Vikas Adam as the companion is supposed to be a soldier, but he comes across as kind of a passive desk clerk. I think that this voice actor was completely miscast for this role. There's really no energy to his performance. There's no weight. There is no presence as a soldier. And again, his voices for the secondary characters were completely different than the previous narrators, and that really took away from the story. Going back to the idea that an author is usually a pretty deplorable narrator, in this case, Adam Gidwitz got it right. This guy could be a voice actor, I think. His voices for all of the characters were spot on. He did such a great job of treating it like dialogue, like a script, rather than written prose. And that was just such a pleasure to listen to. The only thing I think that I wish had been different with his narration is that I wish that he had given Michelangelo that Italian accent. I really wish he had done that. His accents were passable, but not great. But, you know, because of his intonations and the way that he gave such personalities to the characters that he voiced, it was completely delightful. I forgave all of the little things that I found wrong with it. The author also has endnotes here where he talks about a lot of the research that he did in France, and just he gives you a lot more historical background for the story, references to actual characters that lived in that time, and who was real and who was not, and that kind of thing. They really, really enhanced the story. I think this is the perfect book to put on in the car and have everyone listen to on a long trip. Or even, running errands, running to soccer practice, to band practice, to whatever thing you have to be in the car for. If there are kids in the car, or even just adults, it's a great way to kind of expose everybody to this story. I think middle graders and adults alike will be equally entertained. So those are my thoughts on The Inquisitor's Tale by Adam Gidwitz. If you've read this book, then please let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. And that's it for now from me. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.